at 6:51 a.m. on a Monday. I walked into the building I'd once been an integral part of. However, the first thing I noticed wasn't the usual silence of an office just starting to wake up, but a strange emptiness. The nameplate beside my office door was gone, replaced by a blank steel plate. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, the overhead lights casting unfamiliar shadows on familiar walls. I'd spent 32 years in this building, the last 15 as Chief Strategy Officer. But today I was walking in with a different badge, a different title, and a very different future ahead of me. My name is Richard Keller, and last week, at 58 years old, after successfully closing 3 separate mergers worth a combined $2.7 billion for Axion Technologies, I was demoted to building maintenance staff. Not just any maintenance position, they assigned me to the smallest, least used entrance on the north side of the complex. The entrance that even most employees forgot existed. The irony wasn't lost on me as I inserted my new key card into the utility closet that would now serve as my office. 3 months ago, I had been in Singapore closing the final details of our acquisition of Velour Holdings, a deal that would cement Axion as a global leader in advanced materials. Today, I was checking the inventory of toilet paper and wondering if the mop bucket had been emptied properly by the weekend staff. I arranged my few personal belongings, a coffee mug my daughter had given me years ago, a small desk clock that had traveled with me across 19 countries during negotiations, and a family photo from when my wife was still alive on the single metal shelf above the sink. The utility closet smelled of industrial cleaning products and stale air. It was a far cry from my former corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the city skyline. As I sorted through the cleaning supplies, trying to create some semblance of order, my mind drifted to the meeting that had changed everything. It had been a Thursday afternoon, unusually warm for October. I'd been summoned to a conference room. I rarely used the small one on the executive floor with no windows. That should have been my first clue. Something was wrong. Inside were Melissa Canton, our new 36-year-old CEO who'd been with the company all of 7 months, Bradley Fisher from HR, and Greg Talwin, the 32-year-old wunderkind who'd been brought in from our biggest competitor 6 months prior. I knew Greg had been eyeing my position from day one, making comments in meetings about legacy thinking and the need for fresh, strategic approaches. I just hadn't expected Melissa to buy into it so quickly. "Richard," Melissa had said, not quite meeting my eyes, "we're making some organizational changes to better position Axion for the future." The rest was corporate speak: restructuring, realignment, streamlining operations. But the message was clear: I was out, not fired, which would have triggered my substantial severance package, but demoted so severely it was clearly designed to make me quit. But why I had just successfully led the company through its most ambitious expansion phase. The Velour Holdings deal alone had increased our market cap by 40%. Something didn't add up. I was jarred from my thoughts by the sound of the north entrance door opening. It was just past 7:30 a.m. now, and some early employees were starting to arrive. I quickly grabbed a broom and dustpan, feeling a strange mix of shame and defiance as I stepped out to do my job. The first person through the door was Diane from accounting. She'd been with the company for 12 years. I'd personally approved her promotion to department head 4 years ago when her predecessor retired. She walked right past me, her eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away uncomfortably. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the bizarre situation, just the hurried steps of someone eager to escape an awkward encounter. Throughout that first morning, I watched as people I had worked alongside for years, some I had hired, mentored, and championed, pretended not to see me. A few nodded politely as they would to any maintenance staff, but most simply looked through me as if I had become invisible overnight. The younger employees, those who had joined in the last few years and might not recognize me out of context, didn't even offer that much, treating me with the casual indifference often reserved for service workers. But the real gut punch came just before lunch. Thomas Reeves, my former deputy CSO, and someone I'd considered a friend, walked through the north entrance with 2 members of his team. I had handpicked Thomas 7 years ago, seeing something special in the ambitious young manager. I'd spent countless hours mentoring him, brought him into high-level meetings he wouldn't normally have access to, even helped him navigate a difficult period when his marriage was falling apart. As Thomas approached, I straightened up from where I'd been needlessly polishing a handrail. Surely Thomas would stop, say something, express surprise, confusion, or at the very least, basic human acknowledgement. He looked directly at me as he drew near, a flash of recognition crossing his face. For a brief moment, I thought he might pause. Instead, he picked up his pace slightly, angling away from me as he and his companions passed by, engaged in animated conversation about quarterly projections. Not a word, not a nod, not even the courtesy of a good morning to the janitor. That moment crystallized everything for me. This wasn't just a demotion, this was an erasure. They weren't just taking away my title and office, they were attempting to wipe away my legacy, my contributions, my very existence within the company I'd helped build. And they expected me to either slink away in humiliation or endure this degradation until retirement. What they had forgotten, what everyone had apparently forgotten, was exactly who they were dealing with. I spent the remainder of that first day methodically cleaning the north entrance area. But my mind was elsewhere, cycling through 3 decades of memories, achievements, and the intricate knowledge I'd accumulated. I remembered the nights I'd spent away from my family. The Christmas morning I'd missed because I was on a flight to Frankfurt to salvage a failing negotiation. The countless weekends sacrificed to ensure Axion's success. As I emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces, I recalled the early days of the first merger. Back when Axion was still a mid-sized materials science company looking to expand. I had identified Nexus Polymers as the perfect acquisition target. They had the patents and research capabilities we needed, but were struggling with commercialization. The deal had been complex, with regulatory hurdles that seemed insurmountable at times. I remembered the breakthrough moment, sitting in a hotel room in Brussels at 3 a.m., when I'd devised the 3-tier corporate structure that would satisfy both European and American regulators while preserving the tax advantages we needed. That structure became the foundation for all our subsequent growth. The second merger, bringing in Kyoto Materials, had been even more challenging. Japanese corporate culture presented unique obstacles, and there had been significant resistance from their board. I had spent nearly 6 months shuttling between Tokyo and our headquarters, gradually building trust and addressing concerns. In the end, it was my proposal for a semi-autonomous research division that had won them over, allowing them to maintain their identity while integrating into our broader corporate structure. And then, Velour Holdings, the crown jewel. A Singapore-based advanced materials giant with complementary technologies and market access throughout Asia. That negotiation had been a chess match from start to finish, with competing offers from 2 multinational conglomerates. We had been the underdogs. But through careful relationship building and strategic concessions, I had secured the deal that transformed Axion into a global powerhouse. 3 mergers, $2.7 billion in combined value, and a corporate structure that I had designed from the ground up, and now I was mopping floors. As the day wound down and the building emptied, I found myself alone in my utility closet, staring at the family photo on my shelf. My late wife, Catherine, smiled back at me, her eyes bright with the fierce intelligence that had made her such a formidable partner in life. Beside her, our daughter Emma at her college graduation, looking so much like her mother it sometimes hurt to see. Catherine had always been my moral compass, the one who would ask the difficult questions. Is this right? Is this who you want to be? What example are you setting? What would she say about my current situation, about what I was considering doing in response? I knew the answer. Catherine would tell me to stand up for myself, but to do it with integrity. To fight, but not to become the thing I was fighting against. With that thought in mind, I reached for my personal phone, not the company device they'd reclaimed, and began to craft a series of emails. Not angry diatribes or threats, but carefully composed messages filled with facts and subtle reminders. The recipients would be the CEOs and board chairs of the 3 companies we had merged with over the years. Individuals with whom I had built relationships of trust during those intense negotiations. I didn't send the emails that night. Instead, I saved them as drafts and went home to my empty house, had a simple dinner, and slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time since the demotion, I had a plan. The next morning, I arrived at work at precisely the same time. 6:51 a.m. The early hour wasn't just habit, it gave me time to observe the building, waking up, to map the routines and movements of key personnel. Knowledge is power, and despite my current title, I was accumulating new knowledge each day. By the end of the first week, several patterns had become clear. Greg Talwin, my replacement, typically arrived around 8:45 a.m., stopping first at the executive coffee bar before heading to what used to be my office. He rarely left the executive floor before lunch, which he usually took with Melissa and 2 or 3 other senior executives at the in-house cafe. His afternoons were filled with meetings, mostly with external consultants who had begun appearing with increasing frequency. These consultants worried me. They moved through the building with the confident swagger of people who believed they were there to fix something broken. I recognized the type. I'd hired similar firms myself over the years when specific expertise was needed. But this felt different. The few snippets of conversation I overheard suggested they were conducting some kind of organizational audit, with particular focus on our integrated systems. By the second week, I'd established a reputation as a diligent, invisible presence. The north entrance was immaculately maintained, and I had gradually expanded my territory to include the adjacent corridors, always with a mop or cleaning cart as my shield. People had grown accustomed to my presence, which meant they no longer made efforts to avoid conversations near me. I became background noise, which was exactly what I needed. It was on Thursday of that second week that I overheard a conversation that confirmed my suspicions. 2 of the consultants were waiting for the elevator, coffee cups in hand, apparently unaware of my presence around the corner where I was dusting a particularly clean fire extinguisher cabinet. "The integration is a mess," said the taller one, a woman with a crisp British accent. "Whoever designed this system created unnecessary interdependencies between the divisions. That's what happens when old-school executives try to manage modern acquisitions," replied her colleague. "Talwin was right to bring us in. If they want to streamline operations and eventually split the divisions for separate IPOs, this entire architecture needs to be rebuilt." "Can it be done without disrupting operations?" asked the first consultant. "It'll be painful, but yes. The bigger problem is that no one seems to have complete documentation on how everything is connected. We're having to reverse engineer entire processes." The elevator arrived then, cutting their conversation short. But I'd heard enough. They were planning to dismantle my carefully constructed corporate architecture, the very design that had made these mergers successful in the first place. Each acquisition had been built with specific interconnections and dependencies by design, not by accident. I had created a structure where each division relied on the others in subtle but critical ways, ensuring that the whole remained greater than the sum of its parts. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about creating a corporate entity that couldn't easily be broken apart and sold off piecemeal by future leadership. Apparently, that future leadership had arrived sooner than I'd anticipated, and they wanted to do exactly what my design prevented. That night, I finally sent the emails I had drafted. Not all of them, just carefully selected messages to key individuals who would understand the implications of what I was sharing. I wasn't blowing whistles or making threats. I was simply making certain people aware that the corporate structure they had agreed to when joining Axion was being systematically dismantled. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday helping Emma move into her new apartment in the city. She was 26 now, with a promising career in environmental law. We didn't talk much about my situation. I had told her I was taking on a different role at work, downplaying the humiliation. Emma had enough on her plate without worrying about her father's corporate drama. On Sunday, I received the first responses to my emails. Hiroshi Tanaka, the former CEO of Kyoto Materials, who now sat on Axion's board, was concerned about what I had shared. The terms of their merger had included specific protections for their research division, protections that would be threatened by the restructuring Greg and his consultants were planning. Li Wei, who had led Veller Holdings and now headed our Asia-Pacific operations, was more direct in his response. The integrated supply chain I had designed was critical to their regional strategy, and any attempt to streamline it would compromise years of careful market positioning. He wanted details, and he wanted to know why I was no longer overseeing strategic operations. By Monday morning, I knew my messages had caused ripples. The executive floor had an energy I could feel even from my remote position. More senior leaders were arriving early, and the consulting team seemed to be in constant motion between meetings. Around 10 a.m., I was replacing paper towels in the north entrance restroom when my phone vibrated with a text message. It was from Thomas Reeves, my former deputy who had walked past me without acknowledgement that first day. "What did you do, board members calling emergency meetings? Melissa furious. Greg looking like he's about to have a stroke." I didn't respond. Thomas had made his choice when he decided I no longer existed. Besides, I hadn't done anything yet, not really. I had simply shared information with people who had a right to know. The fact that this information was causing such consternation spoke volumes about what Greg and Melissa had been planning. At lunchtime, I made my way to the small break room near the north entrance where maintenance staff typically ate. It was empty. As usual, most of the cleaning crew worked evenings, and I was the only one assigned to this section during day shift. I was halfway through my sandwich when the door opened and Melissa Canton walked in. She looked out of place in the dingy break room, her tailored suit and carefully styled hair contrasting sharply with the industrial surroundings. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway, as if uncertain how to proceed. Then she straightened her shoulders and approached my table. "Richard," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you have a moment to talk?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "I believe I do. Melissa? My schedule is surprisingly open these days." She sat down, placing her hands flat on the table. "I've been receiving some concerning calls from board members and division heads. They seem to think we're planning major structural changes without proper consultation." "Are you?" I asked, taking another bite of my sandwich. "We're exploring options for optimizing operations," she replied, falling back on corporate jargon. "Standard procedure for any new leadership team." I nodded slowly. "And my reassignment was that also standard procedure?" A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. "Your position was eliminated as part of our organizational restructuring. We found an alternative role that allowed you to remain with the company. As a janitor." "As a member of our facilities team," she corrected, as if the euphemism somehow made it better. "Melissa," I said, setting down my sandwich. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence. You wanted me gone but couldn't fire me without cause. You hoped I'd quit rather than accept this position. What I don't understand is why. The Velour merger was successful beyond anyone's expectations. Our stock is at an all-time high. What exactly did I do to warrant this?" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if ensuring we were still alone. "It wasn't personal, Richard. Greg presented a compelling vision for Axion's future, one that required a different approach to our corporate structure." "A structure I designed?" I pointed out. "A structure that has generated billions in value." "A structure that's overly complex and resistant to change," she countered. "We need flexibility in today's market, not rigid interdependencies." And there it was the real issue. My integrated corporate architecture was intentionally resistant to the kind of flexibility that would allow pieces of the company to be easily sold off. Greg hadn't just wanted my job. He wanted to dismantle what I had built so that Axion could be broken apart and sold in pieces, generating short-term profits at the expense of long-term value. Those rigid interdependencies are what made these mergers work, I said quietly. They're what convinced companies like Kyoto and Velour to join us instead of our competitors. Melissa leaned forward slightly. "Richard, I respect what you've accomplished, but business evolves, and strategies need to evolve with it. Greg's approach aligns with where the board wants to take the company. Does it have you actually discussed these plans with the full board, with representatives from the merged entities who sit on that board?" Her slight hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked finally. It was a fair question. What did I want? Revenge? My old job back neither seemed quite right. I want the company I helped build to succeed, I said after a moment. I want the promises we made to our merger partners to be honored. And yes, I want to be treated with the respect I've earned after 32 years. If I arrange a proper retirement package, full benefits, stock options, a generous consulting retainer, would you consider stepping away quietly? Help smooth this transition instead of fighting it. She was offering a golden parachute. And just weeks ago, I might have accepted it. But now I understood too much about what they were planning. I'll consider any formal offer you want to make, I said, neither accepting nor rejecting her implicit proposal. But I'd suggest you talk to the full board first. Make sure everyone understands exactly what these optimizations will mean for the company. Melissa nodded, clearly relieved that I hadn't immediately refused. I'll have something drawn up. She stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, this situation, your current position, it wasn't my idea. Greg felt it would be motivating. It certainly has been, I replied with a small smile. After she left, I finished my lunch in silence, contemplating our conversation. Melissa wasn't the villain here. She was new to the CEO role and likely being influenced heavily by Greg and whatever faction of the board had supported his vision. But she was still accountable for her decisions, including the decision to humiliate a loyal executive instead of offering a dignified transition. That afternoon, as I was cleaning the glass doors of the north entrance, I noticed Thomas approaching from the parking lot. This time, he was alone, and his purposeful stride made it clear he was coming to speak with me. Richard, he said as he reached the doors, actually using my name for the first time since my demotion. Can we talk? I gestured to a small seating area just inside the entrance. A few chairs arranged around a low table where visitors sometimes waited to be escorted into the building. We sat, and for a moment, Thomas seemed at a loss for words. I owe you an apology, he finally said. The way I've been acting ignoring you, it's inexcusable. Yes, it is. I agreed, not making it easier for him. I thought we were friends, Thomas. He winced. We were. Are. I didn't know how to handle this situation. One day you're my boss. The next, you're. He gestured vaguely at my maintenance uniform. Still the same person. I finished for him. Still someone who mentored you, supported you, helped you through your divorce. I know, he said, looking genuinely ashamed. I convinced myself I was protecting my own position by distancing myself from you. It was cowardly. I couldn't argue with that assessment. So, what's changed? Why are you talking to me now? Thomas glanced around before lowering his voice. Everything's chaos upstairs. Board members calling emergency meetings, division heads from Asia and Europe demanding explanations. And the technical teams are in a panic because they've discovered something odd in the system's architecture. Odd how? I asked, though I had a good idea what he meant. The consultants were mapping all the interdependencies between divisions, trying to figure out how to separate them cleanly. They discovered what they're calling a kill switch embedded in the core architecture. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was pleased they had found it so quickly. I hadn't hidden it, after all. A fail-safe, I corrected, not a kill switch. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. So, it is real. They weren't sure if it was intentional or just a quirk of how the systems evolved. It's very intentional, I confirmed. Built into the foundation of how our three merged companies interact. If certain conditions are met or not met, critical integration points begin to fail in sequence. What conditions? Thomas asked, though I suspected he already knew. Protection of the corporate structure as defined in the merger agreements. I said simply. If anyone attempts to dismantle the architecture in ways that violate those agreements, the system essentially rejects the changes. Like an immune response, Thomas murmured. Exactly like that. It's not malicious, it's protective. I designed it to prevent exactly the kind of asset stripping operation Greg seems to be planning. Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing this information. The consultants claim they can work around it, rebuild the connections from scratch if necessary. I smiled slightly. They're welcome to try. but the interdependencies are woven throughout every level of our operations, from supply chain to financial reporting to customer data. Attempting to force changes would likely result in cascading failures across multiple systems. That's what they're afraid of, Thomas confirmed. Greg is furious. He's been in closed-door meetings with Melissa all day. And you? Where do you stand in all this, Thomas? He met my gaze directly for the first time. I should have stood by you from the beginning. I was wrong not to. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was a start. It's not too late to do the right thing, I told him. Not for you, and not for the company. Thomas nodded slowly. What are you planning to do? For now, continue cleaning the north entrance. It's surprisingly satisfying work. I stood up, reaching for the glass cleaner I'd set aside. The rest depends on Melissa, Greg, and the board. As Thomas left, I returned to my duties, but with a lighter heart than I'd had in weeks. The pieces were in motion now. I hadn't designed the failsafe as a weapon or a tool for revenge. It had been a genuine protection mechanism built to ensure the merged companies remained integrated as promised, but it was certainly proving useful in my current circumstances. That evening, after my shift ended, I drove to a small coffee shop across town where I had arranged to meet Li Wei. He had flown in from Singapore specifically to discuss the situation, a fact that underscored how seriously he was taking my concerns. Li was already there when I arrived, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual business attire, a deliberate choice. I suspected, to keep our meeting low profile. Richard, he said warmly as I approached his table, standing to shake my hand. It's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. We ordered coffee and spent a few minutes catching up on personal matters. His daughter had just started university in the States. My Emma was thriving in her new job. Then the conversation inevitably turned to business. I've spoken with Hiroshi and several other board members, Lee said, his expression growing serious. None of us were fully briefed on these restructuring plans. They were presented as operational optimizations, not fundamental changes to the corporate architecture. That doesn't surprise me, I replied. Greg is smart enough to know that you and Hiroshi would object if you understood the full implications. Lee nodded grimly. The board is divided. Some members are aligned with Greg's vision. They see potential for significant short-term gains if the divisions can be separated and either taken public individually or sold to strategic buyers. At the expense of the long-term integrated value we've built, I pointed out. Precisely, and in violation of the specific terms we negotiated during our merger. Lee took a sip of his coffee before continuing. I've called for a special board meeting next week. Hiroshi will be there in person, as will representatives from Nexus. We intend to challenge these plans directly. And my situation? I asked, though it felt self-serving to bring it up. Lee smiled slightly. Your reassignment has not gone unnoticed. It was poorly received when the full circumstances became known to those of us who worked closely with you during the mergers. I appreciate that, I said, but my personal grievances are secondary to protecting what we built together. They are connected, Lee insisted. Your removal was clearly the first step in dismantling the integrated structure you designed. They couldn't proceed with their plans while you were in a position to object. We talked for another hour, discussing strategy for the upcoming board meeting and reviewing the specific protections built into each merger agreement. Lee had brought copies of the original documents, and together we identified the clauses that would be most relevant to challenging Greg's restructuring plans. As we were preparing to leave, Lee asked the question I'd been expecting all evening. The fail-safe system the technical teams have discovered, is it as significant as they believe? It's not a bomb, if that's what you're asking. I replied carefully. It's a series of interlocking dependencies designed to maintain the integrity of our integrated operations. Attempting to force structural changes without proper protocols would trigger increasingly severe system responses, essentially. The corporate equivalent of an autoimmune reaction. And you control the system. I shook my head. No one controls it. It's built into the architecture itself. But, I added, I am the only one who fully understands how it works and how to safely navigate structural changes when they are necessary and appropriate. Lee nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. Then your expertise will be essential, regardless of the outcome of next week's meeting. We parted with a handshake and a promise to stay in touch as events unfolded. As I drove home that night, I felt the first real stirrings of hope since my demotion. I might still be a janitor tomorrow, but the tide was beginning to turn. The next day, Friday of my second week in maintenance, brought an unexpected development. I arrived at my usual time to find Bradley Fisher from HR waiting by the north entrance. "Richard," he said with the forced cheerfulness HR professionals often adopt during uncomfortable conversations. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I replied, unlocking the utility closet and gesturing for him to follow me inside. The small space felt even more cramped with two people. Bradley looked distinctly uncomfortable standing amid the mops and cleaning supplies. "I've been asked to discuss a change in your assignment," he said, handing me an envelope. "Effective immediately, you're being transferred to a special projects role reporting directly to the CEO." I took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. "What kind of special projects?" "The details are all in there," Bradley said, clearly eager to complete this task and leave. "But essentially, you'll be serving as a senior advisor on integration issues related to our merged divisions." So Melissa had decided to act quickly, not waiting for the board meeting Lee had mentioned. Interesting. "And does this senior advisor role come with an office?" I asked mildly. "Or will I be conducting my advisory sessions from this utility closet?" Bradley winced slightly. "Your previous office has been reassigned, but we've arranged for you to use one of the conference rooms on the executive floor as your temporary workspace until a permanent solution can be found." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for bringing this to me. Bradley, I'll review the details and report as directed." He seemed relieved that I wasn't making a scene. "Great. If you have any questions about the transition, don't hesitate to reach out to HR." After he left, I opened the envelope and reviewed the documents inside. The role was real enough senior advisor on integrated operations with a salary that matched my previous position as CSO. The job description was vague, but centered on ensuring continuity of integrated functions across divisions and advising leadership on structural dependencies. In other words, they needed me to help them understand the fail-safe system I had built. I changed out of my maintenance uniform and into the spare business clothes I kept in my car for emergencies. Then I made my way to the executive floor for the first time since my demotion. The receptionist did a double take when she saw me approaching, then quickly composed herself. "Mr. Keller," she said. "Ms. Canton is expecting you. Conference room E has been prepared for your use." Conference room was one of the smaller meeting spaces tucked away in a corner of the executive floor. It had no windows and was typically used for vendor presentations or overflow meetings when the larger rooms were booked. Not exactly a corner office, but a significant upgrade from a utility closet. Inside, I found a laptop set up on the conference table, along with a new company phone and ID badge. The ID indicated my new title and showed all areas access a necessary provision if I was to help address the integration issues. I had just finished setting up the laptop when Melissa arrived. She looked harried, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept well. "Richard," she said, closing the door behind her. "Thank you for accepting this new role." "Did I have a choice?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she would frame it. She sighed, taking a seat across from me. "Of course you did. But I'm glad you're willing to help us work through these challenges." These challenges being the fail-safe systems I designed to protect our integrated corporate structure, I clarified. Melissa didn't bother denying it. "Yes. Our technical teams are struggling to map the full extent of the interdependencies, and the consultants are concerned that attempts to modify the architecture could trigger cascading failures." "They're right to be concerned," I confirmed. "The system was designed specifically to prevent the kind of restructuring they're attempting." She leaned forward slightly. "Richard, I understand you had good intentions when you built these safeguards, but times change, markets evolve, and companies need to adapt." "I agree completely," I said, surprising her. Adaptation is essential, but there's a difference between evolution and dismemberment. The restructuring plans I've heard described would effectively dismantle what makes Axion successful as an integrated enterprise. That's one perspective, she conceded. Others on the board see potential for unlocking greater value by allowing each division to operate more independently. By unlocking greater value, you mean selling them off separately, I said bluntly. Melissa didn't deny it. Some divisions might benefit from different ownership structures, yes, but that's a board-level decision to be made after careful consideration of all options. A board that includes representatives from the merged companies who specifically negotiated against such eventualities. I pointed out, which is why we need your help, she said, bringing the conversation back to my new role. We need to understand how to safely evaluate all options without triggering these protective systems. It was a reasonable request on the surface who wouldn't want to understand their options, but I knew that understanding would quickly become dismantling once they had the knowledge they needed. I'll help map the integration points, I said carefully. But any modifications to the architecture would need to be approved by representatives from all three merged entities, as stipulated in the original agreements. Melissa frowned slightly. That's a very restrictive interpretation of the governance provisions. It's the correct interpretation, I replied, and one that Hiroshi, Lee, and others on the board would support. She didn't argue the point further. The special board meeting is scheduled for next Thursday. Until then, please work with our technical teams to document the integration architecture and develop options for safely evaluating structural changes. After she left, I spent the remainder of the day reviewing the current system documentation and meeting with the technical leads who had been trying to map the interdependencies. They were competent professionals who had been given an impossible task, understanding in weeks an integrated architecture that had evolved over years of careful development. By the end of the day, I had a clear picture of how much they knew not enough and how far they had progressed in their mapping efforts not very. I provided enough guidance to help them understand the general principles behind the design, but held back on the specific triggers and fail-safe mechanisms. That knowledge was my only real leverage, and I wasn't ready to surrender it just yet. The weekend passed quietly. I spent most of it at home, reviewing documents and preparing for the week ahead. Emma called on Sunday, and we chatted about her new job and apartment. I told her about my promotion to senior advisor, framing it as a positive development without going into the complex politics behind it. She seemed relieved, which made me realize how worried she must have been about my earlier demotion. Monday morning brought a new dynamic to the office. Word of my return to the executive floor had spread quickly, creating a buzz of speculation. As I walked through the building, I noticed people watching me with curious expressions, whispering to colleagues as I passed. The invisibility of my janitorial role had been replaced by a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for corporate drama unfolding in real time. Greg Talwin was conspicuously absent from the executive floor that morning. According to his assistant, he was working from home, though the tight smile that accompanied this information suggested there was more to the story. Around noon, Thomas stopped by conference room E, closing the door behind him. Quite the reversal of fortune, he commented, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. Temporary, I suspect, I replied. Once they understand the fail-safe system, they'll find another way to sideline me. Thomas shook his head. I'm not so sure. Greg's position is weakening by the hour. The board is divided, and some of the largest shareholders are asking uncomfortable questions about these restructuring plans. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests they weren't fully informed about the potential risks and implications. Thomas said, particularly regarding the merger agreements and the integrated value proposition that justified those deals in the first place. This was interesting news. Shareholders could be a powerful force when properly motivated, especially institutional investors with long-term horizons who had supported the merger strategy. And where is Greg today? Really, I asked. Thomas smiled slightly. In emergency meetings with his faction of the board and the legal team. They're trying to figure out if there's a way to force through the restructuring despite opposition from the merger representatives. There isn't, I said confidently. not without triggering both the technical fail-safes and legal challenges that would tie the company in knots for years. That's becoming clear to everyone, Thomas agreed, which is why your stock is rising, so to speak. For the next few days, I continued working with the technical teams, gradually revealing more about the integration architecture but still keeping the most critical aspects to myself. I met regularly with Melissa, providing updates that were accurate but not comprehensive. She seemed increasingly stressed as the special board meeting approached, caught between competing factions and facing pressure from all sides. On Wednesday afternoon, the day before the board meeting, I received an unexpected visitor to conference room E. Greg Talwin himself finally made an appearance, looking considerably less polished than usual. His typically immaculate suit was slightly rumpled, and the confident swagger had been replaced by a tense, guarded demeanor. "Richard," he said as he entered without knocking, "we need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from me. "I'm all ears, Greg." He remained standing. "This situation has gotten out of hand. What exactly are you trying to achieve?" "I'm doing exactly what Melissa asked me to do," I replied calmly. "Helping the technical teams understand the integration architecture?" "Bullshit," he snapped. "You're deliberately holding back critical information while rallying board members against the restructuring plan." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "I haven't had to rally anyone. Greg, the board members from the merged companies are simply enforcing the agreements they signed. Agreements you apparently didn't bother to read carefully before developing your strategy." His face flushed slightly. "Those agreements allow for structural evolution as business needs change. They allow for evolution, yes, not dismemberment for the purpose of selling off parts to the highest bidder." Greg paced the small conference room, clearly struggling to contain his frustration. "You're being deliberately obtuse. The market has evolved since those mergers. What made sense then doesn't necessarily make sense now." "That's for the full board to decide," I said, "not you and your consultants." He stopped pacing and fixed me with a hard stare. "What do you want, Richard? Is this about your job, your ego? Because if it's compensation you're after, we can certainly discuss a more generous package." I couldn't help but laugh. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about money or titles. It's about respecting the commitments we made to the people and companies who joined us in good faith. It's about honoring the vision that built Axion into what it is today." "Noble sentiments," Greg said dismissively. "But business isn't about sentiment. It's about creating value." "And that's where we fundamentally disagree," I replied. "I believe long-term value comes from building something sustainable, something that honors commitments and treats people, employees, partners, customers with respect. You see value only in terms of the next quarterly report or the next deal." Greg shook his head, as if I were a disappointing student who had failed to grasp a simple concept. "The board meeting tomorrow will settle this. I suggest you reconsider your position before then. Your future at Axion depends on it." After he left, I sat quietly for several minutes, contemplating the encounter. Greg was clearly feeling the pressure, but his threat suggested he still believed he could win the board over to his position. I wasn't so sure. That evening, I met again with Lee Wei and Hiroshi Tanaka, who had arrived from Tokyo earlier in the day. We gathered at my home, away from corporate eyes and ears, to discuss strategy for the board meeting. "The momentum is shifting," Hiroshi said as we settled in my living room with cups of tea. "Several board members who initially supported Greg's vision are now expressing concerns about the legal and operational risks." "What about the chairperson?" I asked. Eleanor Rhodes had been board chair for over a decade and wielded significant influence. Her position on this matter would be crucial. "Eleanor is being careful," Lee said. "She hasn't committed either way, but she's asking the right questions about the merger agreements and the potential disruption from triggering the fail-safe systems." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing our approach for the meeting. Hiroshi and Lee would lead the formal challenge to the restructuring plans, citing specific provisions in the merger agreements. I would be present as a resource on the technical aspects, ready to explain the integration architecture and the risks of attempting to dismantle it. "And if we prevail?" Hiroshi asked as the evening wound down. "What then for you, Richard?" It was a question I had been pondering myself. I haven't decided, I admitted. I'm not sure there's a place for me at Axion anymore, regardless of the outcome. That would be a significant loss for the company. Lee said firmly, your vision and expertise are not easily replaced. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but sometimes moving forward requires letting go of the past. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, giving myself time to prepare for the 9 a.m. board meeting. I had just settled into conference room E when Thomas appeared at my door. Thought you should know, he said without preamble. Greg and Melissa have been in her office since 7 a.m. with the corporate counsel. Something's happening. Any idea what I asked? Thomas shook his head. Not specifically, but the legal team was pulling together documents all night. Word is they found some kind of loophole they think they can exploit. This was concerning but not entirely surprising. Corporate lawyers were adept at finding creative interpretations of even the most carefully crafted agreements. Thanks for the heads up, I told Thomas. I'll be ready. At 8:45 a.m., I made my way to the main boardroom. Board members were already arriving, greeting each other with the reserved cordiality typical of such gatherings. I noticed Eleanor Rhodes deep in conversation with Hiroshi and Lee, her expression serious but unreadable. Greg and Melissa entered together at 8:55, followed by two members of the legal team carrying folders of documents. Greg looked confident again, his earlier frustration replaced by a calm determination that made me uneasy. At precisely 9 a.m., Eleanor called the meeting to order. After the usual formalities, she addressed the purpose of the special session. We're here today to discuss the proposed restructuring of Axion's divisional architecture, she began. This matter has generated significant concern among some board members, particularly those representing our merged entities. Before we hear those concerns, I'll ask CEO Melissa Canton to present the restructuring proposal and address the issues that have been raised. Melissa stood, thanking Eleanor before launching into a carefully prepared presentation. She outlined the restructuring plan in more detail than I had previously heard, framing it as a necessary evolution to maintain competitiveness in a changing market. The legal and technical challenges were acknowledged but characterized as manageable with proper planning and expertise. Which brings me to an important announcement, Melissa said, transitioning smoothly to the next slide. I'm pleased to share that Richard Keller has agreed to return to the executive team in a new role as Chief Integration Officer, where he will oversee the safe evolution of our corporate architecture while ensuring all merger commitments are honored. This was news to me. I kept my expression neutral as heads turned in my direction. But internally, I was scrambling to understand this unexpected development. Melissa continued. Richard's unique expertise and historical knowledge make him the ideal person to guide this transition. His temporary reassignment to advisory and, briefly, to facilities maintenance was part of an organizational assessment process that has now concluded. It was an elegant attempt at revisionist history, transforming my humiliating demotion into a planned assessment process. I wondered how many people in the room actually believed it. After Melissa finished, Hiroshi and Lee presented their concerns about the restructuring proposal, citing specific provisions in the merger agreements that they believed would be violated. The legal team responded with their interpretations, pointing to clauses that allowed for organizational evolution under certain conditions. The discussion grew technical and occasionally heated as board members weighed in from both sides. Throughout, I remained silent, observing the dynamics and waiting for the right moment to contribute. That moment came when Greg, clearly frustrated by the resistance from Hiroshi and Lee, attempted to dismiss the technical concerns about the fail-safe systems. The integration architecture, while clever, is ultimately just code and processes, he said dismissively. Our technical teams and consultants are confident they can map and modify these systems safely, with Mr. Keller's assistance in his new role. Eleanor turned to me. Richard, as the architect of these systems, would you agree with that assessment? All eyes in the room turned to me. This was the crux of the matter. Could the integrated architecture be safely dismantled to enable Greg's vision of separate divisions ripe for individual sale? No, I said simply, I would not agree. The boardroom fell silent. "Would you elaborate?" Eleanor prompted. I nodded, standing to address the room more formally. The integration architecture isn't just code and processes. It's the embodiment of the commitments we made during the merger negotiations, commitments that are reflected in the legal agreements, but implemented through thousands of interconnected systems and workflows. I turned to the screen where technical diagrams from Melissa's presentation were still displayed. These simplified models don't capture the true complexity of the integration. The fail-safe mechanisms aren't separate systems that can be isolated and disabled. They're woven into the fabric of how our divisions interact, from supply chain to financial reporting to customer data. But surely with your guidance, these challenges could be overcome. Greg interjected. Not without violating the spirit and letter of our merger agreements, I replied firmly, and not without destroying value that has taken years to create. I proceeded to walk the board through specific examples of how the integrated architecture created synergies that would be lost if the divisions were separated. The proprietary materials flow between Kyoto's research division and Velour's manufacturing operations. The shared customer data platform that enabled cross-selling opportunities across all divisions. The integrated financial systems that optimize global tax positions. These aren't just technical connections, I explained. They're strategic advantages that our competitors can't easily replicate. Dismantling them for the sake of short-term gains would be irreversibly destructive to Axion's long-term value. The discussion continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about both the technical and strategic implications. Throughout, I noticed Eleanor watching carefully, her keen intelligence evident in the precision of her questions. Finally, she called for a short recess before the board would vote on how to proceed. As people filed out for a break, Melissa approached me. "That Chief Integration Officer position is real," she said quietly. I wasn't just saying it for the board's benefit. "Why the sudden change of heart?" I asked. She glanced toward where Greg was engaged in intense conversation with several board members. "Let's just say I've gained a better understanding of the situation over the past week. Your perspective has merit, and I should have considered it more carefully from the beginning." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of sorts. "And Greg, he seems to think I'll be helping implement his vision in this new role." Melissa smiled thinly. "Greg has many talents, but reading the room isn't always one of them. The board is shifting, Richard. I need to position myself and the company accordingly." After the recess, Eleanor called for votes on two separate motions. The first, regarding the proposed restructuring, was rejected by a significant margin. The second, authorizing a comprehensive review of potential evolutionary changes that would respect the core integration architecture, passed unanimously. Greg sat stone-faced as the results were announced. His earlier confidence evaporated. As the meeting adjourned, he left quickly without speaking to anyone. In the aftermath, I found myself surrounded by board members offering congratulations and, in some cases, apologies for not intervening sooner in my reassignment. Eleanor took me aside for a private word. "That was quite a performance," she said with a knowing look. "Though I suspect you had this outcome planned from the moment they moved you to maintenance." I smiled slightly. "I'd like to think I'm strategic, Eleanor, but even I couldn't have predicted exactly how this would unfold." "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But you understood the leverage you held better than Greg or Melissa did. The question now is, what will you do with your victory?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been pondering myself. The offer of the Chief Integration Officer role was tempting. In some ways, it would provide a platform to protect what I had built and shape Axion's future evolution. But it would also mean continuing to work within a system that had been willing to discard me so casually after decades of service. "I haven't decided yet," I told her honestly. "I need some time to consider my options." Eleanor nodded. "Take the time you need, but know that your experience and perspective would be valuable to the board, regardless of your executive role." It was an intriguing suggestion. A board position would offer influence without the day-to-day pressures of an operational role. Something to consider. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. News of the board's decision spread quickly throughout the company, generating a mix of relief and uncertainty. Greg submitted his resignation the following morning, effective immediately. Melissa announced an interim organizational structure that emphasized stability and continuity while a longer-term approach was developed. I moved out of conference room E and into a proper office, not my old one, which had been reassigned, but a comparable space with the same impressive view of the city. My new title and role were officially announced, generating a flood of congratulatory messages and meeting requests. Thomas stopped by on Friday afternoon, closing the door behind him. "So, the janitor becomes the king," he said with a smile. "Or at least a very influential duke." I laughed. "Hardly. Just an old strategist who happened to build in some insurance policies." "Speaking of which," Thomas said, his expression growing more serious, "the technical teams are still trying to fully map those fail-safe systems. They're wondering when you'll share the complete documentation." "All in good time," I replied. "First, I want to be sure we have alignment on the path forward, a vision that honors our commitments while allowing for sensible evolution." Thomas nodded, understanding my caution. "And will you be the one leading that evolution? There are rumors you might be considering other options." "I'm exploring possibilities," I acknowledged. "This experience has given me a different perspective on what I want for the next phase of my career." "Well, whatever you decide, I hope there's still a place for me in your plans," Thomas said. "I've learned some valuable lessons about loyalty and courage these past few weeks, mostly by negative example, unfortunately." I appreciated his candor. "We all make mistakes, Thomas. It's what we learn from them that matters." After he left, I turned to the window, gazing out at the city skyline as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the urban landscape. The view reminded me of something Catherine used to say: "Perspective changes everything. Sometimes you need to step back to see the whole picture." My forced step back as a janitor had indeed given me a new perspective on the company, on my colleagues, and on myself. The invisibility of that role had allowed me to observe dynamics I might have missed from the executive suite. The humiliation had tested my resolve and clarified my values, and the struggle to reclaim my dignity had revealed both weaknesses and strengths in the organization I'd helped build. Over the weekend, I considered my options carefully. The Chief Integration Officer role offered the chance to protect and evolve the architecture I had designed. A board position, as Eleanor had hinted, would provide broader influence with less day-to-day involvement. And there were other possibilities: consulting, teaching, even starting something new. By Monday morning, I had made my decision. I arranged meetings with Melissa and Eleanor to discuss my path forward, then spent the day finalizing documentation on the integration architecture. Not the complete documentation; there would always be aspects that existed only in my mind, but enough to ensure that those who came after me could maintain and evolve the systems responsibly. At 6:51 a.m. on Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after I'd walked into the building as a newly demoted janitor, I entered the executive lobby and made my way to Melissa's office for our scheduled meeting. The timing was deliberate, a small reminder of where this journey had begun. Melissa was already at her desk, reviewing documents with a cup of coffee in hand. She looked up as I entered, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Have you made a decision about the CIO role?" she asked, getting straight to the point. "I have," I replied. "I'm going to decline the position." She looked genuinely surprised. "May I ask why you'd have considerable authority to protect the integration architecture you're so concerned about?" "I've realized that protecting what I built isn't my responsibility anymore," I explained. "It's time for new perspectives, new approaches, evolution, as you've said, but guided by the right principles and commitments." "And you don't think you should be the one guiding that evolution?" I shook my head. "Not directly. No. But I've accepted Eleanor's invitation to join the board as an independent director. From that position, I can help ensure that strategic decisions respect our merger commitments while still allowing for necessary change." Melissa considered this for a moment. "That's actually a good solution. The board will benefit from your expertise, and it gives us flexibility to bring in new executive talent." "My thoughts exactly," I agreed. And speaking of talent, I'd recommend considering Thomas Reeves for a senior role in the integration team. He understands both the technical and strategic dimensions, and he's learned some valuable lessons recently about organizational politics. She smiled slightly at that. I'll keep it in mind. Any other recommendations before you transition to your new board role? Just one, I said. Take time to understand the history and context of the company you're leading. The past isn't just a collection of outdated decisions, it's the foundation that supports everything we build for the future. My meeting with Eleanor later that morning was briefer but equally productive. She was pleased with my decision to join the board and outlined her vision for my role as a bridge between the company's past and its future. You won't be an ordinary director, she told me. Your knowledge of the integration architecture makes you uniquely valuable, especially as we navigate the evolution Melissa will be leading. I understand, I assured her. I'll be an advocate for responsible change, not an obstacle to necessary evolution. As I left Eleanor's office, I took a detour through the north entrance area where I had spent those 2 humbling weeks as a janitor. The space was immaculate now, maintained by someone else who probably approached the task with more genuine dedication than I had. I paused by the utility closet that had briefly served as my office, resisting the urge to peek inside. That chapter was closed now. The lessons had been learned, the battle fought and won, not through vengeance or sabotage, but through strategic patience and the leverage of carefully constructed systems. As I walked back through the building toward the executive elevator, I noticed something that had eluded me during my time as maintenance staff. People were nodding to me, making eye contact, offering small smiles of recognition, not because of my title or position, but because they really saw me as a person deserving of basic acknowledgement. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been rendered invisible when demoted to janitor. And now, having reclaimed my status, I was visible again. But the experience had changed how I saw others as well. The security guards, the maintenance staff, the receptionists, all the people who kept the company functioning, but often went unnoticed by executives focused on bigger concerns. In my new board role, I would have a unique opportunity to influence corporate culture and governance, to ensure that Axion valued all its people, not just those with impressive titles or corner offices. That would be my legacy, not just the technical architecture I had designed, but a human architecture that recognized the dignity and contribution of everyone within the organization. As I reached the lobby, I paused to look up at the imposing Axion logo mounted on the wall, a stylized A that resembled a bridge connecting 2 points. How appropriate, I thought. Bridges were my specialty, after all. Connecting companies through mergers, connecting systems through integration architecture, and now connecting past and future through my new role on the board. They had forgotten I held the kill switch, but I had chosen not to use it, at least not in the destructive way they had feared. Instead, I had used my leverage to build yet another bridge, one that would allow Axion to move forward while honoring its commitments and respecting its people. Catherine would have approved, I thought, as I pushed through the revolving door into the bright morning sunlight. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't revenge, but simply proving your value in ways that can't be ignored. They had tried to erase me, but in doing so, they had only highlighted the indelible mark I'd left on the company we had built together. Sometimes, I reflected as I walked toward my car, the janitor really does hold the keys to the kingdom. And sometimes, choosing not to lock everyone out is the most powerful move of all.